on the other hand, Bernhard Meier is saying, yes, mode is real. We can trust the sources. Now, here's the problem. What happens when practice and theory get out of alignment? This is one of the reasons it's such a hard problem to solve. Is theory and practice, sometimes they match. Sometimes one gets way out ahead of the other. Sometimes theory has nothing to do with practice. And sometimes theorists dismiss practically oriented theory because it doesn't make sense theoretically. So Bernhard Meier is a deep believer. He's what we would call a historicist. He's a historicist. He really wants to understand musical sources in the theoretical terms of his day. And you could actually counterpose that to Dahlhaus, because Dahlhaus's wonderful book, which was really my starting point as a graduate student, Robert Yerdingen has this wonderful translation of this, and I've also read it in the German. It's a collection of essays, as well as, I think, Habilitationsschrift or something, which deal with the theory of harmonic tonality. And
I'm glad you bring him up, because I've received several audience questions immediately saying that when I announced that you were coming on, they said,
yeah.
"Oh, but Dahlhaus has tackled this, and Dahlhaus is sort of so that what? Yeah, why didn't you respond to that? So you were going to anyway, but yeah. So what do you think about this whole the state of the research during Karl Dahlhaus's time?
Well, this is an incredibly valuable book. It was indeed my starting point. As a graduate student already, though, as I was reading through this very deeply, I was like, this is not sitting well with me. And so first, let's deal with the question of comprehensivity. Dahlhaus focuses on a relatively small number of mostly Italian and German sources. So in terms of scope, the geographical or the chronological scope is big, but the number of sources is not that big. And so that was one of my aims, is to get away from conjecture about what theorists might be saying, to find out what did all the theorists actually say. So in my research, I've looked at virtually every music theory treatise published.
So you scanned every source possible that's available.
Yes, hundreds and hundreds of books. And then,
just for a comparison, Karl Dahlhaus, how many sources in comparison to what was available for him? I mean, as a sort of ballpark.
He certainly hits the most important sources. Yeah. But for example, among French sources, he primarily deals with Rameau. He doesn't deal at all with many of the other people like Lafillard and Rousseau and Denis and all these other people who give us a much more well-rounded impression of the course of the development. We don't get that with Dahlhaus, so it's not comprehensive in that sense. He touches highlights, he raises issues. The other thing, though, is that Dahlhaus's concern is a very presentist one. We might call it presentist, more specifically at the 19th century question. He is the term, in fact, if we look at the title of his book, The Origins of Harmonic Tonality. For Dahlhaus, he defines harmonic tonality as the representation of key through chordal relationships. Through chordal relationships. And that's really coming out of, especially for him, the Riemannian tradition of the 19th century, and also Fétis, about which Tom Christensen has now done so much work. But that very different French and German 19th century perspectives, but that concern for functional tonality, that's basically where my book ends, because it's Rameau. That Rameau is really kind of the beginning of this notion of chord function, which is subsequently developed in the 19th century. So what Dahlhaus is doing is he's reading backwards into Baroque, 17th century, 16th century, even medieval sources, looking for the earliest clues to this notion of harmonic function and key areas created through chordal relationships. So the problem with this is big, because it causes him to misread the sources. He misreads the sources. He says, that doesn't make any sense. Because the other thing about Dahlhaus, that he himself beautifully articulates this. Theory and practice have an awkward relationship to each other. he says, as soon as you start to evaluate theory according to historical terms, it loses its theoretical essence. But if you go back and you look at Banchieri, you asked earlier for composer theorist. He's a composer theorist. If you go back and look at that music, there start the things in there that as a theorist make me very uncomfortable, especially though when you get to the later 16th or 17th century, the 1600s, like people like Penna, for example. Now, Penna's theory, I use the term loosely, it describes a real living practice. As theory, it's not that great. Likewise, Bononcini, the best theorist of Italy from the second half of the 17th century, he's a really good theorist. Bononcini is great. His Musico Pratico is it's a funny title because it calls practical musician, Musico Pratico. But it has nothing to do with musical practice. It's really out of disconnect. So this is one of the problems with studying theory sources is you have to recognize that theory is its own thing. Sometimes it's closely allied with practice, sometimes it's not. And Bononcini, in writing his theory, writes a theory that's relatively cohesive, but no longer reflective of musical practice. So
I'm sorry, this is that the famous cellist, or is that somebody else?
Yeah, Bononcini, I think, was a cellist.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I think he was. Ask Greg Barnett. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So that's when we coming back to Dahlhaus. Then Dahlhaus rightly does not trust the theoretical sources, but if we look at 17th century sources, we have this problem because someone like Bernhard Meier, who's a historicist, wants to say you must trust the sources. Well, the sources don't work so well. Penna reflects practice, but it's not very good theory. And Bononcini is pretty cogent theory. It has some things in it, but it's the most cogent, but it doesn't really reflect practice. So that's a problem for Bernhard Meier's historicism, but it's also a problem for Dahlhaus's presentist perspectives because it causes him to just dispense Penna as garbage when, in fact, Penna offers really useful insights into how musicians are thinking, including, I might add, the emergence of circularity in tonal thought. So what's really needed then, and Tom Christensen's leadership on this has been so helpful to me, is really a hermeneutic that tries to bring about a rapprochement between those two things so that we recognize the validity of both historicist and presentist concerns, but we always have to really be weighing theory as theory versus theory as a representation of practice.